My name is Marcus Thompson, and I'm 34 years old. If you saw me walking down the streets of downtown Chicago today, you'd probably think I was just another successful businessman in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase worth more than most people's monthly salary. But 14 years ago, I was sleeping in a cardboard box behind McDonald's in Detroit, wondering if I'd live to see another sunrise. This is a story of how I went from being abandoned by my own family at 16, labeled a complete failure by everyone who knew me, to building a multi-million-dollar empire that changed not just my life, but the lives of thousands of others. It's a story about betrayal, heartbreak, determination, and ultimately, redemption that I never thought possible. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone around you gave up on you completely? Where even your own family looked you in the eye and told you that you'd never amount to anything? I want to hear about your experiences in the comments below, because what I'm about to share with you might just change how you see your own potential forever. And if this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more incredible true stories of transformation. The winter of 2006 was brutal in Detroit. I remember because that's when my stepfather, Rick, finally had enough of what he called my worthless attitude and threw me out of the house with nothing but the clothes on my back and $17 in my pocket. My mother, Sandra, stood in the doorway watching as Rick hurled my few belongings onto the frozen front lawn, and she didn't say a single word to defend me. Not one word. "You're 16 now, Marcus," Rick shouted, his breath forming clouds in the bitter cold air. "Time to figure out what kind of man you're going to be, because you sure as hell aren't going to figure out under my roof anymore." My mother just nodded silently, her arms crossed, avoiding my desperate gaze. That's when I realized that the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had given up on me completely. I had been getting into trouble at school. Sure, my grades were terrible. I was hanging out with the wrong crowd, and I had developed what guidance counselors politely called behavioral issues. I was skipping classes, getting into fights, and had been suspended 3 times in the past semester alone. But I was still just a kid, barely old enough to drive, and suddenly I was completely on my own in one of the harshest cities in America during one of the coldest winters on record. The first night was the longest night of my life. I tried sleeping in the local park, but the security guard found me around midnight and told me I had to move along. The temperature was dropping below zero, and I could feel the cold seeping through my thin jacket and into my bones. I wandered the streets for hours, desperately looking for anywhere that might offer shelter from the wind and snow. That's when I found the McDonald's on 8 Mile Road. Behind the building, there was a small alcove where they kept their dumpsters, and it provided just enough protection from the wind to make survival possible. I spent that first night huddled against a brick wall, using newspapers I found in the dumpster's blankets, listening to the sound of traffic, and wondering how my life had fallen apart so completely. I spent the next 3 months making that alcove behind McDonald's my home, surviving on whatever I could find in their dumpster and the occasional handout from strangers. The manager, a kind woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, would sometimes slip me leftover burgers when her shift ended, and those small acts of kindness were literally the only thing keeping me alive during those dark winter months. During those months, I learned what real hunger felt like. Not the kind of hunger you feel when you skip lunch, but the deep, gnawing hunger that makes your stomach cramp and your hands shake. I learned what it meant to be invisible, because people would literally step over me on the sidewalk as if I didn't exist. Business people in their warm coats would walk past without even acknowledging my presence, and I began to understand how easy it was for society to simply ignore the people who had fallen through the cracks. But most importantly, I learned that rock bottom can be a surprisingly solid foundation to build your life on, if you're willing to do the work that nobody else wants to do. I learned that failure isn't permanent unless you decide to make it permanent. And I learned that sometimes the people who abandon you are actually doing you the biggest favor of your life, even though it doesn't feel like it at the time. Those 3 months behind that McDonald's taught me lessons that no business school could ever teach. I learned how to read people instantly, understanding within seconds whether someone might help me or hurt me. I learned how to spot opportunities that others missed, like finding valuable items that people had thrown away, or identify which businesses might be willing to let me do odd jobs for cash. Every morning, I would wake up before dawn and walked to the Detroit Public Library as soon as it opened. The building became my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the cold and the judgment of the outside world. I would spend hours reading business magazines, studying successful entrepreneurs, and trying to understand what separated the winners from the losers in life. The librarians eventually recognized me as a regular visitor, and a few of them would save newspapers and magazines for me to read. One librarian, an elderly woman named Miss Patterson, even started bringing me sandwiches from home, though she never made a big deal about it. She would just leave them on the table where I usually sat, along with a note that said, "Knowledge is power, young man." What I discovered during those long days in the library changed everything about how I saw my situation. I realized that almost every successful person I read about had failed spectacularly at least once before they made it big. Walt Disney was fired from a newspaper for lacking imagination and having no good ideas. Steve Jobs was kicked out of Apple, the very company he had co-founded. Oprah Winfrey was born into poverty and faced abuse and discrimination before becoming one of the most powerful women in media. The difference between people who stayed down and people who got back up wasn't talent, luck, or family connections. It was their willingness to keep moving forward when everything seemed hopeless. It was their ability to see failure as education rather than defeat. And most importantly, it was their refusal to let other people's opinions define what was possible for their lives. I started carrying a small notebook that I had found in a trash can outside a college campus, and I would write down every piece of advice, every success story, every business principle that resonated with me. That notebook became my Bible, my roadmap out of the hell I was living in. The turning point came in March of 2007, when I was still 17 and had been living on the streets for nearly 4 months. I was digging through a dumpster behind a small electronics repair shop in downtown Detroit, looking for anything I could sell or trade for food, when the owner caught me red-handed. I expected him to call the police or chase me away like everyone else did, but instead, this elderly man with thick glasses and grease-stained hands looked at me with something I hadn't seen in months: genuine concern. "Kid," he said in a thick Italian accent, "when's the last time you had a real meal?" I was so shocked by the question that I couldn't even answer. I just stood there, covered in garbage and shame, staring at the stranger who seemed to actually see me as a human being. His name was Frank Castellano, and he had owned that little repair shop for over 30 years. Frank brought me inside his cramped workspace, which was filled with broken televisions, radios, and other electronic devices stacked from floor to ceiling. He sat me down at a folding table in the back room and made me a turkey sandwich while he talked. "I came to this country with nothing but the shirt on my back in 1962, he told me, his weather hands moving expertly as he prepared the food. "Spent my first winter in New York sleeping in subway stations and eating out of trash cans, just like you. My English was terrible, I had no skills, and nobody wanted to hire an Italian immigrant who could barely communicate." Frank explained how a Jewish man named Sol Goldberg had given him his first real chance, teaching him how to repair radios and televisions when most people were throwing them away instead of fixing them. "Sol taught me that every broken thing could be fixed if you understood how it worked and had the patience to do the job right," Frank said. "He also taught me that success wasn't about having natural talent or being born into the right family. It was about showing up every single day, even when you didn't feel like it." The deal Frank offered me was simple but life-changing. He would let me sleep in the storage room behind his shop, and he'd pay me minimum wage to help him repair electronics. In exchange, I had to promise to go back to school and finish my education. "Education is the only thing they can't take away from you once you earn it," he said, and those words are burned into my memory forever. Working for Frank changed everything about how I saw the world and my place in it. He taught me that every piece of electronic equipment had a logical structure, and if you could understand that structure, you could fix almost anything. More importantly, he showed me that the same principle applied to life itself. If you could understand how success worked, you could repair your own broken circumstances. Under Frank's patient guidance, I not only went back to school, but actually started enjoying learning for the first time in my life. I discovered that I had a natural aptitude for understanding how complex systems worked, whether they were electronic circuits, computer programs, or business processes. Frank would bring me broken devices that other repair shops had given up on, and I developed a reputation in the neighborhood for being able to fix things that seemed impossible to repair. By the time I turned 18, I wasn't just Frank's assistant anymore. I was managing most of his day-to-day operations. I had reorganized his entire inventory system, created a customer database on an old computer I had rebuilt from spare parts, and implemented a scheduling system that reduced wait times and increased customer satisfaction. The little shop was more profitable than it had ever been in its 30-year history. Frank started talking about making me a partner, about expanding the business to include computer repair and maybe even opening a second location. We would stay late into the evening, planning and dreaming about all the possibilities that lay ahead of us. For the first time since my family had abandoned me, I started to believe that maybe I could actually build something meaningful with my life. I had my own apartment by then, just a small studio above a barbershop, but it was mine. I had graduated high school with honors and had been accepted to Wayne State University on a partial scholarship. Frank was going to help me pay for the rest of my tuition, and I was planning to study business and electrical engineering. Everything was finally falling into place. That's when everything fell apart again, in a way that was even more devastating than being thrown out by my stepfather, because this time I had something real to lose. Frank had a massive heart attack while we were working late one evening in April of 2009. I was testing a repaired television when I heard him gasp and saw him clutch his chest before collapsing behind the counter. I called 911 immediately and rode with him to Detroit Receiving Hospital, holding his hand in the ambulance while he whispered instructions about keeping the business running and taking care of his regular customers. The paramedics were working frantically to stabilize him, but I could see in their eyes that things weren't looking good. Frank died 3 days later, and that's when I discovered the cruel reality of good intentions without proper legal planning. Despite all his talk about making me a partner, Frank had never actually updated his will to include me. His estranged son, Michael, who lived in San Diego and hadn't spoken to Frank in over 5 years, inherited everything. The shop, the equipment, the customer relationships I had spent 2 years building. Michael arrived in Detroit wearing an expensive suit and driving a rental car, clearly annoyed that he had to deal with what he called this mess. He took one look at the cluttered shop and announced that he was selling everything to a chain electronics store that wanted a location for a new outlet. Within a week, everything Frank and I had built together was gone. Standing outside Frank's boarded-up shop with my few belongings in a duffel bag, I felt like that 16-year-old kid again, abandoned and alone with nowhere to turn. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't just angry or hurt. I was determined. I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I was going to build something so big and so successful that no one would ever be able to take it away from me again. I looked down at that notebook I had been carrying since my homeless days, now filled with over 2 years of additional notes and observations from working with Frank. I realized that I had accidentally created the foundation of my own business education, combining street-smart survival skills with technical expertise and customer service experience. With Frank's shop closed and my carefully planned future destroyed, I found myself back at square one, but this time with a crucial difference. I had skills, experience, and most importantly, a burning determination that nothing could extinguish. I used a small amount of money I had saved from working with Frank to rent a tiny basement apartment in Highland Park, just outside Detroit, and I started planning my comeback. The first challenge was immediate survival. I needed income fast, so I started doing freelance electronics repair out of my apartment, advertising my services on Craigslist, and putting up flyers in local neighborhoods. Word spread quickly that there was a young guy who could fix anything electronic for half the price of the big repair shops, and within a month, I had more work than I could handle. But I knew that trading my time for money wasn't going to build the kind of success I was dreaming about. Every night after finishing my repair work, I would study business books I borrowed from the library, trying to understand how to scale a service business into something bigger. I was particularly fascinated by companies like Geek Squad, which had turned computer repair into a nationwide franchise operation. That's when I had my first big idea. Instead of just fixing electronics, what if I could teach other people to fix electronics and take a percentage of their earnings? I could create a network of independent repair technicians, provide them with training and support, and build a business that generated income whether I was personally working or not. I spent 3 months developing what I called the TechFix Academy, a comprehensive training program that would teach people with no technical background how to diagnose and repair common electronic problems. I created detailed manuals, step-by-step video tutorials using a borrowed camera, and even developed a certification system that would give graduates credibility with potential customers. The program was designed to be completed in just 6 weeks, and I priced it at $2,500, which seemed like a fortune to charge at the time. But I knew that if I could help people start their own repair businesses and earn $50,000 or more per year, the investment would pay for itself quickly. I was essentially selling people the same opportunity that Frank had given me, but in a structured, scalable way. Finding my first students was harder than I had anticipated. I spent weeks cold calling people who had posted resumes on job sites, visiting unemployment offices, and even approaching people who looked like they needed work at bus stops and grocery stores. Most people thought I was running some kind of scam. After all, what 19-year-old kid could teach them skills that would change their lives? My breakthrough came when I met Carlos Rodriguez, a laid-off auto worker who had been unemployed for 8 months and was desperate for any opportunity to support his family. Carlos was skeptical at first, but when I offered to let him audit the first week of classes for free, he agreed to give it a try. Within 3 days, Carlos was successfully repairing broken radios and small appliances, and he became my first paying student. Carlos's success story became my marketing tool. He completed the program, started his own repair business, and within 2 months was earning more money than he had made at the auto plant. Even better, he referred 3 of his unemployed friends to my next class, and suddenly I had more demand than I could handle. By the end of 2009, I had trained over 40 people through TechFix Academy, and about 30 of them had successfully started their own repair businesses. I was charging each student $2,500 for the 6-week program, which meant I was generating over $100,000 in revenue from training alone. But the real money was coming from my partnership agreements with the graduates. Each TechFix Academy graduate who wanted ongoing support could join my network for a monthly fee of $200, which gave them access to advanced training materials, bulk purchasing discounts on parts and tools, and most importantly, a steady stream of referrals from my growing marketing efforts. About 80% of my graduates joined the network, creating a recurring revenue stream that was growing every month. The network model was working better than I had ever imagined. I was essentially building a franchise system without the legal complications of actual franchising. My technicians were independent contractors who kept most of their earnings, but they benefited from the collective marketing power and shared resources of being part of a larger organization. However, success brought new challenges that I hadn't anticipated. As word spread about TechFix Academy, I started getting attention from competitors who weren't happy about a teenager disrupting their established repair businesses. Several local shop owners complained to the Better Business Bureau, claiming that I was running an unlicensed educational institution and that my graduates were taking their customers. The situation escalated when a reporter from the Detroit Free Press wrote an article about my program, portraying me as either a brilliant young entrepreneur or a sophisticated con artist, depending on which sources she quoted. The article brought me more attention than I had ever wanted, including scrutiny from state regulators who questioned whether my training program needed to be licensed as a vocational school. Suddenly, I was spending more time dealing with lawyers and regulators than actually running my business. The legal fees were eating into my profits, and the negative publicity was making it harder to attract new students. Several of my network members started questioning whether they wanted to be associated with a program that was generating controversy. Just when things seemed to be stabilizing, I faced my biggest crisis yet. One of my graduates, a guy named Steve Morrison, had apparently been using the TechFix Academy name to run his own training program without my permission. Worse, Steve's program was substandard, and several of his students had complained to local authorities when they couldn't find work after completing his course. The regulatory investigation that followed threatened to shut down my entire operation. I spent weeks providing documentation to prove that Steve Morrison wasn't affiliated with my official program, but the damage to my reputation was already done. Several local news stations ran stories about questionable electronics training programs, and my student enrollment dropped by 60% almost overnight. I realized that I had built my business too quickly, without properly protecting my intellectual property or establishing clear legal boundaries. At 19 years old, I was learning expensive lessons about the difference between having a good business idea and having a sustainable business structure. The empire I thought I was building was actually much more fragile than I had realized. The regulatory investigation dragged on for months, and during that time, I watched everything I had built start to crumble. My lawyer bills were mounting faster than I could pay them, and I was forced to stop accepting new students until the investigation was resolved. Many of my network members became nervous about the negative publicity and stopped paying their monthly fees, which eliminated my primary source of recurring income. By spring of 2010, I was barely keeping my head above water financially. I had burned through most of my savings defending myself against allegations that I knew were false, but proving my innocence was turning out to be more expensive than I had ever imagined. I was back to doing individual repair work just to pay rent, and I felt like I was moving backwards instead of forwards. The lowest point came when I received a cease and desist letter from a large electronics repair chain that claimed I was infringing on their trademark training methods. Their lawyers argued that my repair manuals were too similar to their internal training materials, and they demanded that I stop using my curriculum or face a federal lawsuit for intellectual property theft. I knew their claims were ridiculous. I had developed every aspect of my training program from scratch, based on my own experience working with Frank and my independent research. But fighting a federal lawsuit would cost more money than I had, and even if I won, the legal fees would bankrupt me. I was facing the possibility of losing everything I had worked for because I couldn't afford to defend myself against false accusations. That's when I made one of the hardest decisions of my life. I temporarily shut down TechFix Academy and took a job working for someone else. A former student named Maria Santos had used her training to start a computer repair business that was doing well, and she offered me a position as her head technician. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now working for someone I had trained, earning $15 per hour to do work that I used to charge hundreds of dollars to teach. Working for Maria was humbling, but it also gave me something I desperately needed: time to think and plan without the constant pressure of running a business under legal attack. During my lunch breaks, I would sit in my car and review everything that had gone wrong, try to understand how I could have built my business differently to avoid the problems I was facing. I realized that my biggest mistake had been focusing too much on rapid growth and not enough on building proper legal and operational foundations. I had been so eager to scale my success that I had skipped important steps like trademarking my materials, establishing clear licensing agreements, and creating proper oversight systems for my network members. More importantly, I understood that I had been trying to build a business in a space where I didn't have enough credibility or resources to compete with established players. The electronics repair industry was dominated by companies with decades of experience and deep pockets, and they weren't going to let a teenager disrupt their market without a fight. But instead of seeing this as a permanent defeat, I started viewing it as valuable market research. I was learning firsthand what it took to survive in a competitive industry, and I was developing skills and insights that would be invaluable when I was ready to start my next venture. Every legal challenge and business setback was teaching me lessons that couldn't be learned from books. During my 6 months working for Maria, I spent every evening and weekend researching new business opportunities that would allow me to leverage my skills without competing directly with established players in the electronics repair industry. I was looking for a market that was underserved, growing rapidly, and where my technical background would give me a real advantage. That's when I discovered the emerging world of smartphone repair. In 2010, smartphones were becoming mainstream, but most people had no idea how to fix them when they broke. The iPhone had only been around for 3 years, and Android phones were just starting to gain popularity. Most electronics repair shops were still focused on televisions and computers, and the few places that would work on smartphones charged outrageous prices and took weeks to complete simple repairs. I realized that smartphone repair could be the perfect opportunity for me. The technical skills were similar to what I already knew, but the market was so new that there weren't any entrenched competitors with deep pockets and legal teams. Even better, Smartphone users were typically younger, more tech-savvy people who would be more willing to trust a young entrepreneur than the traditional electronics repair customers. I convinced Maria to let me start offering smartphone repair services as a side business through her shop, with the understanding that I would split the profits with her 50-50. My first repair was an iPhone 3G with a cracked screen, and I charged $80 for a repair that took me less than an hour to complete. The customer was so impressed with the quick turnaround and fair price that he immediately referred 3 of his friends. Within a month, smartphone repairs were generating more revenue than all of Maria's traditional computer repair services combined. We were getting customers from all over Detroit, and I was completing an average of 15 repairs per day. The profit margins were incredible. I could buy replacement parts online for $20 and charge $80 to $120 for repairs that took me 30 to 60 minutes to complete. But I could see that Maria was becoming uncomfortable with how quickly the smartphone side of the business was growing. She had started her company to do computer repair, and she didn't fully understand the smartphone market or feel confident managing that part of the operation. More importantly, I could see that my success was making her question whether she really needed a partner at all. The tension came to a head when I proposed that we expand the smartphone repair operation by opening dedicated locations in shopping malls around Metro Detroit. Maria felt that the expansion was too risky and that we should focus on building the existing business steadily. I understood her perspective, but I also knew that the smartphone repair market was growing so rapidly that we needed to move fast to establish our position before larger competitors entered the space. After several difficult conversations, Maria and I agreed that it would be best for me to leave and start my own smartphone repair business. She was generous enough to let me take the smartphone repair customers with me, and she even helped me find a small retail space in a busy shopping center in Southfield, about 20 minutes outside of Detroit. In November 2010, I opened Fix-It Fast Mobile Repair with $5,000 in startup capital that I had saved from my work with Maria. The shop was tiny, just 200 square feet, but the location was perfect. I was surrounded by a cell phone store, a coffee shop, and a busy food court, which meant there was constant foot traffic of exactly the type of customers I was trying to reach. Fix-It Fast Mobile Repair was an immediate success. Within the first week, I was averaging 20 repairs per day, and by the end of my first month, I had a waiting list of customers and was working 12-hour days just to keep up with demand. The smartphone repair market was even bigger than I had anticipated, and I was one of the first people in the Detroit area to specialize exclusively in mobile device repairs. My competitive advantage was speed and convenience. While other repair shops were telling customers to leave their phones for a week, I was completing most repairs in under 2 hours. I had developed an efficient workflow that allowed me to diagnose problems quickly, and I kept a large inventory of common replacement parts, so I rarely had to order anything special. By spring of 2011, I was generating over $15,000 per month in revenue from my single location, and my profit margins were consistently above 70%. I had hired 2 part-time employees to help with the volume, and I was starting to think about expansion again. This time, however, I was determined to do it right. I spent months researching franchise law, trademark protection, and business licensing requirements. I consulted with lawyers and accountants to make sure that any expansion I did would be built on solid legal and financial foundations. I was not going to repeat the mistakes I had made with TechFix Academy. My expansion plan was ambitious, but carefully structured. Instead of trying to train independent contractors like I had done before, I decided to open company-owned locations in shopping centers throughout Michigan and eventually expand into other states. I would maintain direct control over quality and customer service, while building a brand that could compete with national chains. The first expansion location opened in Grand Rapids in August 2011, followed by locations in Ann Arbor and Flint before the end of the year. Each new store was generating positive cash flow within 60 days, and I was reinvesting every dollar profit back into additional locations. By the end of 2011, I had 6 Fix-It Fast locations and was on track to generate over $500,000 in annual revenue. That's when disaster struck in a way I never could have anticipated. Apple released iOS 5 in October 2011, which included a software update that made many older iPhones significantly more difficult to repair. The update changed how the phones handle certain hardware components, and suddenly about 40% of my repair jobs were taking twice as long to complete or failing altogether. Even worse, Apple simultaneously tightened their restrictions on who could purchase genuine replacement parts. Previously, I had been able to buy authentic iPhone parts from wholesale distributors, but Apple started requiring authorized repair centers to sign exclusive agreements that prevented them from selling parts to independent shops like mine. This forced me to rely on aftermarket parts that were often lower quality than the original components. Customer complaints started increasing, and my reputation for reliable repairs began to suffer. Several customers demanded refunds when their phones developed new problems within weeks of being repaired with aftermarket parts. The situation was made worse by the fact that I had signed long-term leases for all 6 of my locations, based on revenue projections that assumed my repair business would continue growing at its previous rate. When my revenue dropped by 30% almost overnight due to the Apple software changes and parts restrictions, I suddenly found myself overextended and struggling to cover my fixed costs. I tried everything I could think of to adapt to the new market conditions. I expanded into repairing Android phones and tablets, added services like screen protectors and phone accessories, and even started offering device trade-ins and sales of refurbished phones. But none of these additions generated enough revenue to offset the decline in my core iPhone repair business. By summer of 2012, I was facing the darkest period of my entrepreneurial journey. 3 of my 6 locations were operating at a loss, and I was burning through my savings just to keep the doors open. I had personally guaranteed the leases on all my stores, which meant that if the business failed, I would be personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in remaining rent payments. The stress was overwhelming. I was working 18-hour days, trying to manage 6 locations, while also handling customer service complaints, inventory management, and increasingly difficult conversations with landlords who were concerned about my ability to make rent payments. I had gone from feeling like a successful young entrepreneur to feeling like I was drowning in responsibilities that were beyond my ability to handle. The breaking point came in September 2012, when I received notice that one of my largest landlords was terminating my lease due to late rent payments. The Southfield location, which had been my original and most profitable store, was being evicted with just 30 days' notice. Losing that location would eliminate nearly 40% of my remaining revenue, making it impossible to keep any of the other stores operating. I spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how to save the business. I considered taking on investors, but my financial situation was so desperate that I would have had to give up majority control of the company for a relatively small amount of money. I looked into business loans, but my debt-to-income ratio was already too high for any bank to consider lending to me. The hardest part was facing my employees, who had trusted me to provide them with stable jobs. I had to lay off 4 of my 6 part-time workers, and I could see the disappointment and worry in their eyes. These were people who had believed in what I was building, and I felt like I was letting them down just as badly as my stepfather had let me down years earlier. In October 2012, I made the painful decision to close 4 of my 6 stores and consolidate operations into just the Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor locations. This meant breaking leases, paying termination fees, and essentially admitting that my expansion had been a massive failure. The financial hit was devastating, but was the only way to avoid complete bankruptcy. Even with the downsizing, the remaining 2 stores were barely breaking even. I was back to working by myself most days, doing repairs while also handling all the administrative work that had previously been divided among multiple locations. I felt like I had gone backwards 5 years, and I was starting to question whether I had what it took to build a truly successful business. The lowest moment came in December 2012, when I was working alone in the Grand Rapids store on a Friday evening, trying to complete a backlog of repairs before the weekend. A customer came in to pick up his iPhone, and when I handed it to him, he immediately noticed that the screen had a slight color distortion that hadn't been there when he dropped it off. "You people don't know what you're doing," he said loudly, attracting the attention of other customers in the shopping center. "This is exactly why you should only trust Apple with Apple products. You're just some kid playing around with expensive equipment." His words hit me harder than they should have, because part of me was starting to believe that maybe he was right. That night, I sat in my car in the parking lot after closing the store, looking at my phone and seriously considering calling my mother for the first time in 6 years. I wanted to tell her that maybe Rick had been right. Maybe I really was destined to be a failure. But then I remembered something Frank had told me years earlier. The difference between a successful person and a failure is that the successful person fails 7 times and gets up 8. Sitting in that parking lot in December 2012, I realized that I had been approaching my problems all wrong. Instead of trying to fight against the changes in the smartphone repair industry, I needed to figure out how to use those changes to my advantage. Apple's restrictions on independent repair shops weren't just hurting me. They were creating massive frustration among smartphone users who were being forced to pay premium prices for simple repairs. That frustration represented an opportunity, but I needed to think bigger than just fixing individual phones. I started researching what was happening in other industries when large corporations tried to control the repair market, and I discovered the growing right-to-repair movement that was gaining momentum across multiple sectors. The right-to-repair movement argued that consumers should have the legal right to repair their own devices or choose where to have them repaired, rather than being forced to use manufacturer-authorized service centers. This movement was particularly strong in the automotive industry, where independent mechanics had successfully fought for access to diagnostic tools and replacement parts. I realized that the smartphone repair industry was facing the same battle that auto mechanics had fought decades earlier, and there was an opportunity to position myself as an advocate for consumer rights rather than just another repair shop competing on price. This shift in perspective changed everything about how I saw my business and my role in the market. Instead of just trying to survive as a small repair shop, I started building Fix It Fast into a platform for independent repair advocacy. I began writing blog posts about Apple's anti-competitive practices, creating videos that showed consumers how to perform simple repairs themselves, and building relationships with journalists who were covering technology and consumer rights issues. My first major breakthrough came when I was interviewed by a reporter from TechCrunch about Apple's practice of voiding warranties for devices that had been repaired by independent shops. The article generated thousands of comments and shares, and suddenly I was receiving emails from repair shop owners across the country who were facing similar challenges. I started organizing other independent repair businesses into an informal network that we called the Independent Mobile Repair Alliance. We shared information about sourcing quality parts, developed standardized repair procedures, and most importantly, we began advocating collectively for legislative changes that would protect consumers' right to repair their own devices. The advocacy work was generating significant media attention, but it wasn't immediately translating into increased revenue for my remaining stores. However, I could see that I was building something much more valuable than just a local repair business. I was becoming a recognized voice in a national conversation about technology and consumer rights. The real turning point came in March 2013, when I was invited to testify before Michigan State Legislative Committee that was considering a right-to-repair bill for electronic devices. My testimony about how manufacturer restrictions were hurting small businesses and limiting consumer choice was covered by several major news outlets, including CNN and the Wall Street Journal. Suddenly, I wasn't just Marcus Thompson, the guy who fixes phones in shopping malls. I was Marcus Thompson, the young entrepreneur who was fighting against corporate monopolies and standing up for consumer rights. The media attention brought customers to my remaining stores, but more importantly, it brought opportunities that I never could have imagined. A venture capital firm in Chicago reached out to discuss funding and expansion of my repair business. A book publisher asked if I would be interested in writing about my experiences as a young entrepreneur. Most significantly, I started receiving speaking invitations from business conferences and entrepreneurship programs at universities across the Midwest. The speaking opportunities turned out to be the key that unlocked everything I had been working toward. My first paid speaking engagement was at the University of Michigan's Business School in April 2013, where I was asked to talk about entrepreneurship and overcoming failure. I was nervous about speaking to a room full of MBA students who probably knew more about business theory than I did, but my story resonated with them in ways I hadn't expected. After my presentation, several students approached me with questions about starting their own businesses, and I realized that my real value wasn't just in my technical skills or business experience. It was in my ability to inspire people who felt like they were starting from nothing. I had lived through the kind of failures and setbacks that most business school case studies only talked about in theoretical terms. Word spread quickly through the university network, and within 6 months, I was receiving 3 to 4 speaking requests per month from colleges, business organizations, and entrepreneurship conferences. My speaking fee started at $2,500 per engagement, but as my reputation grew, I was able to charge $5,000 and eventually $10,000 for keynote presentations. The speaking income was significant, but the real value was in the connections I was making with successful entrepreneurs, investors, and business leaders who attended these events. I was meeting people who had built companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and they were treating me as a peer rather than just some kid who had gotten lucky. One of those connections changed the trajectory of my entire career. At a conference in Dallas in September 2013, I met Sarah Chun, a serial entrepreneur who had sold 2 technology companies and was now working as a partner at a venture capital firm. After my presentation, Sarah approached me with an observation that stopped me in my tracks. "You're solving the wrong problem," she said bluntly. "You're trying to build a repair business when what you should be building is an education business. You're a natural teacher, and there are millions of people who want to learn what you know about starting and growing a business." Sarah explained that the online education market was exploding, and there was huge demand for practical, real-world business training from someone who had actually built and scaled companies. She suggested that instead of trying to expand my repair shops, I should focus on creating online courses that could reach thousands of students simultaneously. The idea intrigued me, but I was skeptical about whether people would pay for online business education from someone who was only 23 years old. Sarah laughed and pointed out that my youth was actually an advantage. I could connect with aspiring entrepreneurs who were intimidated by older, more traditional business experts. Over the next 3 months, Sarah mentored me through the process of developing my first online course. We called it From Homeless to Millionaire, the real story of building a business from nothing, and it covered everything from surviving failure to scaling operations to dealing with legal challenges. The course was priced at $497 and included 12 hours of video content, downloadable worksheets, and access to a private online community where students could ask questions and share their own experiences. I was targeting people who were stuck in dead-end jobs or struggled with their own business ventures, and I promised to teach them the specific strategies I had used to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. When we launched the course in January 2014, I was hoping to sell maybe 50 copies in the first month. Instead, we sold over 300 copies in the first week, generating nearly $150,000 in revenue. The demand was so strong that our payment processing system crashed twice during the launch, and I had a hire customer service help to handle all the inquiries. But the real validation came from the feedback I received from students. They weren't just buying the course. They were implementing the strategies and getting real results in their own businesses and careers. The speaking opportunities turned out to be the key that unlocked everything I had been working toward. My first paid speaking engagement was at the University of Michigan's Business School in April 2013, where I was asked to talk about entrepreneurship and overcoming failure. I was nervous about speaking to a room full of MBA students who probably knew more about business theory than I did, but my story resonated with them in ways I hadn't expected. After my presentation, several students approached me with questions about starting their own businesses, and I realized that my real value wasn't just in my technical skills or business experience. It was in my ability to inspire people who felt like they were starting from nothing. I had lived through the kind of failures and setbacks that most business school case studies only talked about in theoretical terms. Word spread quickly through the university network, and within 6 months, I was receiving 3 to 4 speaking requests per month from colleges, business organizations, and entrepreneurship conferences. My speaking fee started at $2,500 per engagement, but as my reputation grew, I was able to charge $5,000 and eventually $10,000 for keynote presentations. The speaking income was significant, but the real value was in the connections I was making with successful entrepreneurs, investors, and business leaders who attended these events. I was meeting people who had built companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and they were treating me as a peer rather than just some kid who had gotten lucky. One of those connections changed the trajectory of my entire career. At a conference in Dallas in September 2013, I met Sarah Chun, a serial entrepreneur who had sold 2 technology companies and was now working as a partner at a venture capital firm. After my presentation, Sarah approached me with an observation that stopped me in my tracks. "You're solving the wrong problem," she said bluntly. "You're trying to build a repair business when what you should be building is an education business. You're a natural teacher, and there are millions of people who want to learn what you know about starting and growing a business." Sarah explained that the online education market was exploding, and there was huge demand for practical, real-world business training from someone who had actually built and scaled companies. She suggested that instead of trying to expand my repair shops, I should focus on creating online courses that could reach thousands of students simultaneously. The idea intrigued me, but I was skeptical about whether people would pay for online business education from someone who was only 23 years old. Sarah laughed and pointed out that my youth was actually an advantage. I could connect with aspiring entrepreneurs who were intimidated by older, more traditional business experts. Over the next 3 months, Sarah mentored me through the process of developing my first online course. We called it From Homeless to Millionaire, the real story of building a business from nothing, and it covered everything from surviving failure to scaling operations to dealing with legal challenges. The course was priced at $497 and included 12 hours of video content, downloadable worksheets, and access to a private online community where students could ask questions and share their own experiences. I was targeting people who were stuck in dead-end jobs or struggled with their own business ventures, and I promised to teach them the specific strategies I had used to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. When we launched the course in January 2014, I was hoping to sell maybe 50 copies in the first month. Instead, we sold over 300 copies in the first week, generating nearly $150,000 in revenue. The demand was so strong that our payment processing system crashed twice during the launch, and I had to hire customer service help to handle all the inquiries. But the real validation came from the feedback I received from students. They weren't just buying the course. They were implementing the strategies and getting real results in their own businesses and careers. By the end of 2014, my online education business had completely transformed my life and my financial situation. I had sold over 2,000 copies of my flagship course and had launched 3 additional programs focused on specific aspects of entrepreneurship: the Failure-Proof Business Plan, Marketing on Zero Budget, and Legal Protection for Small Business Owners. The online courses were generating over $100,000 per month in revenue, with profit margins above 85%. Unlike my repair shops, which required constant hands-on management and had limited scalability, the education business could grow exponentially without proportional increases in my time investment. I was finally building the kind of business I had dreamed about since those days in the Detroit Public Library. More importantly, I was having a real impact on people's lives. My students were starting successful businesses, getting promotions at their jobs, and most significantly, developing the confidence to pursue opportunities they never would have considered before taking my courses. I was receiving emails and testimonials from people who said my training had literally changed the direction of their entire careers. The success of the online education business allowed me to make a decision that felt like the ultimate vindication of my journey. I was ready to go back to Detroit and face my family, not because I needed their approval, but because I wanted to close that chapter of my life on my own terms. In March 2015, I drove back to the house where I had grown up, the same house where my stepfather had thrown me out 9 years earlier. The neighborhood looked smaller and more run down than I remembered, and I felt like I was visiting a place from someone else's life rather than my own past. My mother answered the door, and for a moment, neither of us knew what to say. She looked older and more tired than I remembered, and I could see in her eyes that she recognized how much I had changed. I wasn't the angry, confused teenager she had watched leave. I was a confident, successful adult who had built something meaningful with his life. "Hello, Mom," I said simply. I thought it was time we talked. We sat in the same living room where I had spent so many miserable evenings as a teenager. But this time the conversation was completely different. My mother explained that she had always regretted not standing up for me when Rick threw me out, but she had been afraid of losing her marriage and her financial security. She had convinced herself that the tough love approach would force me to grow up and take responsibility for my life. Rick was no longer in the picture. They had divorced 3 years earlier when he lost his job and started drinking heavily. My mother was working 2 part-time jobs to pay the mortgage on a house that was worth less than what she owed on it. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who had called me a failure was now the one who couldn't keep his life together. I listened to my mother's explanation without anger or resentment. I had learned through my own struggles that people make decisions based on their circumstances and their fears, and that holding grudges only hurts the person carrying them. I wasn't there to relitigate the past. I was there to offer something better for the future. Mom, I said, I want to help you get back on your feet, but I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this because I need your approval or because I'm trying to prove anything. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do and because I'm finally in a position where I can afford to be generous. I helped my mother pay off her mortgage and get her finances stabilized. But more importantly, I convinced her to enroll in one of my online courses about building a service business. At 58 years old, she was terrified of starting over. But she had always been good at organizing and managing household tasks, and I saw an opportunity for her to start a home organization and cleaning service. Within 6 months, my mother had built a small but profitable business with 12 regular clients and was earning more money than she had made at both of her part-time jobs combined. Watching her discover her own entrepreneurial abilities was one of the most satisfying experiences of my entire journey. She wasn't just financially independent again. She was proud of what she was building. The reconciliation with my mother was deeply meaningful, but also confirmed something I had suspected for years. My real family wasn't defined by blood relationships or shared history. My real family was a community of entrepreneurs, mentors, and students who had supported my growth and believed in my potential even when I didn't believe in myself. Frank Castellano had been more of a father to me in 2 years than my stepfather had been in 6. Sarah Chun had provided more valuable guidance and support than any biological relative ever had. Even my students, many of whom I had never met in person, had become part of an extended network of people who were committed to each other's success. By 2016, my online education business had grown to include a team of 15 employees and was generating over $3 million in annual revenue. I had moved my headquarters to Chicago, where I had access to better talent and infrastructure, and I was starting to think about expanding internationally. But the real milestone came in November 2016, when I reached a net worth of $10 million. I was 30 years old, exactly the age I had always imagined I would be when I made it, and I had built something that was bigger and more meaningful than anything I had dreamed about during those nights sleeping behind the McDonald's. The success felt surreal, but it also felt inevitable. Every failure, every setback, every moment of doubt had been preparing me for this level of achievement. I understood now that success wasn't just about reaching a financial goal. It was about developing the character and capabilities that would allow me to sustain and grow that success over time. More importantly, I had learned that true success was measured not just by what you accomplish for yourself, but by what you made possible for others. My courses had helped thousands of people start businesses, change careers, and build better lives for themselves and their families. I was creating value that extended far beyond my own personal wealth. The speaking engagements had evolved into something much bigger as well. I was now delivering keynote presentations at major business conferences, corporate retreats, and university commencements across the country. My fee had increased to $25,000 per engagement, and I was booked solid for months in advance. In 2017, I signed a book deal with a major publisher to tell my story in detail. Abandoned but not defeated, How Failure Became My Foundation for Success became a New York Times bestseller and opened up even more opportunities for media appearances, consulting engagements, and strategic partnerships. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the launch of the Marcus Thompson Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided entrepreneurship training and microgrants to young people who had aged out of the foster care system or were experiencing homelessness. I was using my success to create opportunities for people who were facing the same challenges I had overcome. By 2018, my business empire had expanded far beyond anything I had originally envisioned. The online education platform had grown to serve over 50,000 students worldwide, with courses translated into Spanish, Portuguese, and Mandarin. We had developed partnerships with major corporations that wanted to provide entrepreneurship training to their employees, and we were generating over $8 million in annual revenue. The Marcus Thompson Foundation had awarded over $2 million in grants to more than 500 young entrepreneurs, and our success stories were being featured in national media. One of our grant recipients, a former foster kid named David Martinez, had used our $5,000 micro grant to start a food truck business that had grown into 3 restaurants in Phoenix. Stories like David's reminded me every day why my work mattered beyond just the financial rewards. But the achievement that meant the most to me personally came in June 2018, when Wayne State University invited me to deliver the commencement address to their business school graduating class. This was the same university where I had been accepted on a partial scholarship 12 years earlier, before Frank's death had derailed my plans for traditional higher education. Standing at that podium, looking out at hundreds of graduating students and their families, I was overwhelmed by how far I had traveled from that cardboard box behind the McDonald's. But I was even more amazed by how clearly I could trace the connection between every struggle I had faced and every success I had achieved. 12 years ago, I told the graduates, I was supposed to be sitting where you are today. Instead, I was working in an electronics repair shop, trying to figure out how to rebuild my life after losing the closest thing to a father I had ever known. At the time, I thought my dreams of higher education were over forever. I explained to them that traditional education was just one path to knowledge and success, and that the most valuable lessons I had learned had come from real-world experience, failure, and the mentorship of people who believed in my potential. Your degree is important, I said, but your willingness to keep learning, growing, and adapt to challenges will determine how far you actually go in life. After the ceremony, I was approached by Dr. Patricia Williams, the dean of the business school, who had an interesting proposal. The university wanted to create a new program that would combine traditional business education with practical entrepreneurship training, and they were looking for someone to help design and teach the curriculum. The idea of becoming a professor had never occurred to me, but the more I thought about it, the more excited I became. I could reach students at the beginning of their careers, when they were most open to new ideas and approaches. I could help them avoid some of the mistakes I had made, while also inspiring them to take the kinds of risks that had ultimately led to my success. In September 2018, I began teaching a course called Entrepreneurship in Practice at Wayne State University. The class was limited to 20 students per semester, and we focused on real-world business challenges rather than theoretical case studies. Students were required to start actual businesses during the course, and I provided both guidance and seed funding for their ventures. The teaching role brought a new dimension to my work that I hadn't expected. Working with college students reminded me of my own hunger for knowledge and opportunity at their age, and it forced me to articulate and systematize many of the insights I had developed through experience but had never formally organized. More importantly, it connected me to a new generation of entrepreneurs who were facing challenges and opportunities that were very different from what I had encountered. They were dealing with social media marketing, global competition, and rapidly changing technology landscapes that required different strategies and approaches than the ones I had used. Today, as I write this story in 2020, I'm 34 years old, and my net worth has grown to over $25 million. But those numbers, while significant, don't capture what really matters about this journey. What matters is that I built something sustainable and meaningful that extends far beyond my own personal success. My online education business now serves over 100,000 students in 47 countries. We've helped people start businesses in industries I never could have imagined, from sustainable farming in Kenya to technology startups in Eastern Europe. The ripple effects of what we've created continue to expand in ways that still amaze me. The Marcus Thompson Foundation has grown into a $10 million endowment that provides not just grants, but comprehensive support systems for young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. We've partnered with organizations in 12 major cities to create entrepreneurship programs in homeless shelters, foster care facilities, and community centers. But perhaps most importantly, I've learned that success isn't a destination you reach. It's a process you commit to for life. Every achievement opens up new challenges and opportunities, and staying successful requires the same qualities that help me survive on the streets: adaptability, resilience, and absolute refusal to give up when things get difficult. The lessons I learned during those dark months behind the McDonald's have served me well at every stage of my journey. When my repair business was struggling with Apple's restrictions, I remember that you have to adapt to circumstances you can't control. When I was building my online education platform, I applied the same systematic thinking that Frank had taught me about understanding how complex systems work. Most importantly, I never forgot that success is measured not just by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute. Every student who starts a successful business, every grant recipient who builds something meaningful, every person who hears my story and decides not to give up on their dreams. These are the real rewards of everything I built. The reconciliation with my mother has evolved into something beautiful and unexpected. She now manages the day-to-day operations of one of our foundation programs, using her own experience of starting over later in life to mentor other women who are rebuilding their careers after divorce or other major life changes. She's become one of our most effective advocates because she speaks from authentic experience about the possibility of transformation. Looking back, I could see that every person who abandoned me or told me I would never amount to anything was actually giving me a gift, though they didn't realize it at the time. They were forcing me to develop inner strength and self-reliance that I never would have discovered if my path had been easier. They were teaching me that other people's opinions about my potential were irrelevant compared to my own determination to prove them wrong. But I also learned that holding on to anger and resentment would have poisoned my success and prevented me from helping others. Forgiveness isn't about excusing people's behavior. It's about freeing yourself to focus on building something better than what you've experienced. As I sit in my office in downtown Chicago, looking out at the city where I built my life and my business, I often think about that 16-year-old kid who was thrown out into the snow with $17 and no idea how he would survive. I wish I could go back and tell him that everything was going to work out better than he could possibly imagine. But I also know that he needed to go through every struggle to become the person who could create what we've built. The question I want to leave you with is this: what would you attempt if you knew that every failure was just preparation for something bigger, and that every person who gives up on you is actually clearing the path for you to prove what's really possible? Your current circumstances don't define your potential. Your response to those circumstances does. If this story has inspired you to look at your own challenges differently, or if you've overcome similar obstacles in your own life, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of people who refuse to let their past determine their future.